For the last 30 years, the Linux Foundation has been the home for, I would say, the most important open source projects, including the Linux kernel as well. So the world's most used operating system. It powers, I think, 99% of supercomputers. It powers, Android is derivative of Linux, and on and on and on. What the foundation does is a neutral place for organizations, large corporates, large technology companies, governments, etc., to come together and work on these open source code bases, standards, and community specifications in a neutral environment. So what's really critical about what the Linux Foundation does is open development and open governance, right? It's that neutrality that we bring to these projects.
What do you consider the major risks when working in this environment in which open source is basically your main source?
There's this idea out there that open source is not commercial. Building that healthy, growing commercial ecosystem that enterprises can rely on, that's the really important part of that neutrality as well.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lorena Nessi from CCN. And today I'm joined by Daniela Barbosa, Executive Director of Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. We will discuss how open source blockchain infrastructure has evolved from earlier initiatives like Hyperledger into broader decentralized trust ecosystems, and how these technologies are moving into real-world financial and identity systems. Daniela, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to CCN.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's fantastic to be here today, so thank you.
Yes, I'm looking forward to trying to understand and know more about the role of the foundation. So can you tell us in simple ways what you do? What does the Linux Foundation do?
Sure, excellent. So, for the last 30 years, the Linux Foundation has been the home for, I would say, the most important open source projects, including the Linux kernel as well. So the world's most used operating system. It powers, I think, 99% of supercomputers. It powers, Android is derivative of Linux, and on and on and on. So from our start, the foundation, the Linux Foundation as a whole, really critical part of every industry across the world, every government, etc. Over the last 15 plus years, the Linux Foundation has expanded to really have projects that are either industry focused, if you look at cloud computing with Kubernetes, or even in the film industry with the Academy Software Foundation. Obviously, lately, a lot of AI projects as well. But the core thing is what the foundation does is a neutral place for organizations, large corporates, large technology companies, governments, etc., to come together and work on these open source code bases, standards, and community specifications in a neutral environment. So what's really critical about what the Linux Foundation does is open development and open governance, right? It's that neutrality that we bring to these projects. And I'll talk a little bit about that. 10 years ago, the Linux Foundation, along with about 23 different companies, these were technology companies as well as large banks, for example, and other types of organizations, came together to form a blockchain project. This was in 2016, and the concept of blockchain, and at the time, distributed ledger technology was how it mostly was described, was really critical. And I think the industry came to understand early on that DLT, the technology itself, was going to be critical across many industries, including the financial industry as well. So for the last 10 years, we've been the home, previously known as the Hyperledger project. And the initial one project that we had was called Hyperledger Fabric, which was a permission distributed ledger. And the community came together. And so why did the biggest competitors in the space at the time, right? So IBM and SAP, for example, and Microsoft all come together to work on a specific open source project that was a distributed ledger, because they understood that by working collaboratively together in the open, they were going to be able to build something that the industry really needed. So for the last 10 years, our project portfolio at Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, which is our new brand, we rebranded and expanded our mission 2 years ago. And the reason we did this is because we have open source projects and open source communities that are really diverse. They're not just about ledgers anymore, because the adoption of these technologies into production systems today, it's not just a blockchain, right? You have tooling, you have requirements for interoperability, there's cryptography libraries that you need, and we have evolved just like the industry has evolved. And we're very excited about this because, the timing is very perfect. Obviously over the last 18 months, what we've seen in industry, especially in the financial industry, is just an explosion of adoption. I would say that the Linux Foundation and our Hyperledger community and what is now known as Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust have been at the center for the last 10 years in making sure that the institutions understood the value of the technology. Right? It's not just about the crypto or the, investments, right? It is more about how the technology brings efficiencies to markets, how the technology brings financial inclusion into the global markets. And really, these are the things that our community for the last 10 years has been doing.
That's amazing. So you have a long track of educating, right, about this technology. And you say, this is what they have been doing. This is what you have been doing. So how would you say that what's the foundation actually doing right now, day to day, to move these technologies from code into real world adoption or scenarios?
Sure. So it's really, I always phrase it this way. Our foundation, LF Decentralized Trust, essentially does three things. Number one, and the most important pillar, is the developers. And these are developers that are maintainers of the code projects. These are developers that are contributors to the code projects. And these are developers that are users of the code projects, right? And it's very important to keep that developer ecosystem happy and successful, right? So what is the LFDT? I'll abbreviate it from here. LFDT brings to those developers is we help with developer tooling. We help with, very importantly, open source best practices around enterprise open source, right? When a company, a big bank, an organization picks a code project that we host here at Linux Foundation, they especially understand how the code governance is done, that it's openly governed, meaning that everyone can see and anyone can participate in the governance of that code base. It's openly developed, meaning that anyone can come in and start contributing to these open source projects, and there's paths, and it's easy to understand the path to do so. And that it is, an open, obviously, open source, open license perspective as well. So number one, if we're not making the developers happy and successful, we're not doing our job. Number two, and you mentioned this before, Lorena, is training and education, is how do we educate and train an industry of developers and engineers, and very importantly also business leaders, right? Business technical leaders. I'll tell you a story. In 2017, we put out a project, a MOOC, like a online course that was called Intro to Blockchain. That Intro to Blockchain course, over close to 300,000 people took that course and got certified to be Intro to Blockchain, get a certification. Why was that important? Is that at the time in 2017, a lot of our crypto native friends were obviously very involved already in the ecosystem, but there was millions of people that were not, right? So we brought an Intro to Blockchain course to understand, so people could understand and be educated on the technology side. I still have crypto bros, and I lovingly call them crypto bros, come up to me all the time and say, hey, Daniela, the first blockchain course I ever took was the Hyperledger Intro to Blockchain course in 2017 or 2018, right? And it's really great to see that kind of education. Then we do deep dive education and certification. So if you think about these technologies going into productions and going into productions across, not only the biggest organizations, but that long tail. And today we're seeing this across the world, right? Where you have, just in the banking industry, right? You have tier 2, tier 3, and the smaller banks and financial institutions coming on board. How do you make sure that there's engineers to support those code projects and the development and the deployment, very importantly, of that? So at the Linux Foundation and LFDT, we have 2 professional certification courses. So if you wanted to hire an engineer, right? So with a certified developer engineer for Besu, for example, or Hyperledger Fabric, you could hire that, right? That is a certification that we do. So as these projects mature and they go into production, you have to have a trained workforce of engineers. So pillar number one, make those developers happy and successful. Pillar number two is make sure that the market is educated, not only on just general blockchain courses, but we do courses around decentralized identity and zero knowledge proofs, right? A lot of the things that the industry needs, and we keep up with the pace of that. And we make sure there's engineers that can then build and be hired, very importantly, to build and support these systems. And number three, and I think to your point, around production implementations and how do you make these code projects successful, is you need a healthy, neutral commercial ecosystem, right? And this is a very important part of open source. Open source is great. Open source is certainly one. Here in our industry, in the decentralized technology or blockchain industry, open source is one. But that open source that's openly governed, openly developed, and incredibly neutral, not just from where it's hosted, but also the vendors that support it. So for us, the third pillar of what we do in the ecosystem across all these open source projects is make sure that there is a neutral and growing commercial ecosystem supporting these open source projects. Happy developers, a trained and educated community, and then commercial vendors that people can partner with to work on deploying and adopting these solutions as well.
Okay, brilliant. That leads me to two questions. Let's start with the first one. So you're talking about this neutral commercial ecosystem, but at the same time you're talking about decentralization. So I'm very interested in knowing if there is any frontier, any barrier, or any point in which actually centralization is playing a role in there.
Yeah. So it depends on what you mean by, centralization and decentralization, right? So certainly, LF Decentralized Trust is an organization. We host the code projects, right? We host the communities that support, once again, contribute to those code projects and use those code projects as well. So if you think about that, the Linux Foundation is a central organization, but we have members. So companies join, governments join. For example, we have 10 central banks that are part of our member community as well. We have vendors, hundreds of different types of vendors and solution providers. We have institutions, right, that join us as well and support us. So it is open. Anyone can join our foundation. Anyone can use any of the code or the majority of the resources that we have. It's open source, so everyone can use them as well. So really trying to build a decentralized community that does not have, a central point, one entity that supports that as well. So there's a lot in the world, when we think about decentralization, our code projects, and this is really important when I talk about open source that's openly developed and openly governed, right? If you look at our code projects, and particularly we have a project lifecycle, so projects go through a project lifecycle. The graduated projects are the ones that are most advanced, right, in the market. Vendor neutrality and the maintainers working from different companies is extremely important for an open source company, code base. And why is that? And I think, Lorena, you're kind of hinting at that, right? Is how do you make sure that these protocols, how do you make sure that these tools and even standards and specs are not controlled by one company? Right. And what we're seeing in, and we've seen over the last 10 years in the ecosystem is there are a lot of protocols that are managed by the protocol labs team, for example. And that labs team essentially is part of, they get compensated by the treasury, right? So, and this is something that most ecosystems have to start that way. And then as they mature, they really start decentralizing the code development from the governance of the network, from the governance of the treasury. And we truly believe, just across the board, that you want to have decentralization as to where the code gets hosted so that you can always just fork the code and go build your own network if you need to, right? versus where the governance of the network and the governance of the treasury for these blockchain, public blockchain with coins it live as well. So I'll pause there because that probably raised a lot of questions for you.
Well, yes. Let's go into the risks. What do you consider the major risks when working in this environment in which open source is basically your main source?
There's this idea out there that open source is not commercial, right? And open source has commercial versions built out it on the time. So I'll give you an example just, outside of our community so it's easy to understand, right? So take the Linux kernel, right? In our community, but not under LFDT from a blockchain perspective. So take the Linux kernel, right? The Linux kernel, largest operating system in the world. There are multiple versions of Linux that you can purchase, right? And you can work with a vendor to have a version of Linux that they support. They have a version of Linux that they have a SLA, a service level agreement with. They have a version of Linux that they support, from a versioning perspective. You can also download Linux yourself and run it as your own operating system without a vendor, right? Or you can take Linux kernel and build a whole business on top of it, right? That is decentralized, right? That means that anyone can build on it, anyone could develop on it, anyone can build their billion-dollar business on it. But there's a commercial ecosystem if you choose to have a partner, a vendor to work with that can support that. Now, looking into LF Decentralized Trust, our projects, we now have 17 different projects, all at different levels in the project lifecycle. We have protocol, so core protocol projects like Hyperledger Fabric, Besu, and Hyro. Hyro is one of our newest ones. It's the entire code base for the Hedera public blockchain. We have interoperability projects. We have decentralized identity standards and frameworks. We have cryptography projects and smart contract projects, all at different life cycles, right? It does not prohibit, and we see this, take Besu, for example, right? If you want to work with Besu is the Ethereum virtual machine. Besu runs today is an execution client that runs 16% of the Ethereum mainnet. Right. So if you want to run a node on the Ethereum mainnet, you could choose to use Besu. It's, it's there, it's available, it's to use. If you want to work with a staking vendor and they offer Besu or Nethermine or others, you can choose Besu as well. And if you want to run Besu as a permissioned EVM, Ethereum virtual machine, you can do that as well. You can download it. You can run it yourself, right? And you can build things on it. And we see many large financial institutions, for example, doing that. But you can also partner with vendors, right? And we have vendors in our ecosystem who are certified. So we actually have Besu certified service providers, for example, or Hyperledger Fabric certified service providers that you can choose. But it's really important to understand that open source doesn't mean that you get abandoned. Oh, I chose an open source project and now I can't find any help. Our job, that third pillar, remember, I've talked about that, building that healthy, growing commercial ecosystem that enterprises can rely on. That's the really, important part of that neutrality as well.
Brilliant. So you mentioned Hedera and others. So contributing to this code base, to the foundation, do you think this kind of move actually strengthen the neutrality and interoperability? Or do you think that this actually introduces new coordination challenges?
I think a little bit of both, right? And this is what the Linux Foundation, LF Decentralized Trust, our foundation's really focused on, is removing that friction for having a truly open source, openly governed open source project, right? And this is what we're experts on. This is why people bring their code bases to us, why the biggest companies in the world bring their code bases to the Linux Foundation, whether it's Google or Microsoft or OpenAI, Anthropic, right? They want to bring their code projects in their communities because this is what we do. This is our job. We do open source management. We do open source community development as well. So to your question on Hedera, Hedera is the first public blockchain, so public layer 1, that has their entire code base in a neutral foundation. And that's the project called Hyro. And that came into LFDT in September of 2024. So we're about a year and a half into that process. Everything you can go online and see, they've been amazing. That Hyro maintainer community has been amazing at actually documenting the process of how they took that code base from the foundation, the Hedera Foundation, and why they made the decision to bring it over to Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, and the processes that it's been doing. And there's been a lot of work. There was a lot of work in the maintainers across many companies to do that, to make sure that that community is healthy. But once again, that's what we do as staff. That's what we have experts. We have people on staff that have, close to 20 years in open source management and and community management, supporting those kind of things as well. So to answer your question, do I believe that code neutrality brings benefits to the Hedera ecosystem? And Hedera is not the only one that we have in the ecosystem. We have projects across, obviously, I mentioned Ethereum before. We have projects in the Midnight ecosystem as well, Cardano, and obviously a lot of the permissioned DLT ecosystems as well. The answer, I truly believe, is yes, right? Because how else are you going to build that credibility that the roadmap of the core protocols, right, and the core systems is truly open and governed? If it is being basically moved forward by just the treasury incentives, for example, you start seeing some changes in how the behavior, right? The incentives are basically behaviors that's differently. So there is some friction. It is not easy. The Hyro community has been at it for a year and a half. I think they have a fantastic governance structure. They have their own technical steering committee and their own process of how they basically run their systems. And we've seen, very importantly, new contributors and new maintainers to the Hyro project that most likely would not have entered would not have started contributing to that code base because they didn't want to contribute to, basically one single organization perspective, right? And we see this, like I said, it's not an overnight thing. It takes a long time, and it takes very much the commitment of the maintainers and of the developers in the community. And across all projects, we have that. And very importantly, the commitment of the organizations that decide that code neutrality is really the best path forward for their success as well.
Okay, great. So we are talking also about interoperability, right? Which is normally like a solution to fragmentation. It helps us to solve many problems. But what do you think are the main technical or governance challenges in relation to interoperability? In general terms, because I know we cannot point out to all the projects that you're working with.
Yeah, well, I think, the topic of interoperability, it's like, how do you define interoperability as well, right? I think a lot of people in our industry, when they think of interoperability, they cross-chain asset transfers, right? But there's a lot of different requirements on the interoperability side. For us, as an umbrella of these multiple projects, and we actually have category of projects that are called interoperability projects. We have a project called Hyperledger Cacti and one called Smoot. But overall, across the different projects, we see collaboration of across projects around topics like interoperability, right? How do these protocols interact with one another? Interoperability, there are the code elements of interoperability. So our community, for example, our Cacti community works very closely with the IETF that are building standards around digital asset standards at the IETF standards organization. We just this week announced a new project called OTIS, which is the Open Tokenization Asset Standard. This is a community spec standard that is going to be putting together essentially a standard for a standard for token assets across multiple ecosystems. It's not going to be one blockchain related. It's going to be across multiple systems. So we already have participation for many systems as well. So interoperability is collaboration across projects, right? The technical aspects of interoperating between platforms, and then the standards that are needed to do so, right? Because you might call a specific asset X and I call it Y, but the metadata or the things that are important to both of those need to be defined. And so we're doing that work here at LFDT as well, because obviously, across multiple ecosystems, that work needs to get done.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to go into a slightly different topic, one of my favorite topics, which is digital identity. There is a growing attention on this, especially as AI is actually raising concerns, increasingly so around deepfakes and authenticity. So how do you think that decentralized identity systems can help verify what is real without increasing surveillance risks?
Yeah, there's a lot of great work that's been happening in our community for the last 10 years. We actually have a project called Trust Over IP, just celebrated their 6-year anniversary. And that's where all the standard projects around self-sovereign identity, trust registries. We have a project, a working group called the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust Graph, right? So identity is critical and in our community, we've said it's been critical for the last 10 plus years. I actually got involved in the Linux Foundation at the time due to the work that I was doing in the digital identity space. We have, so it's very critical, and it's accelerating, obviously, with the use of agents, for example. So the concepts, and this is not a one foundation and one organization issue that's going to get resolved. There's actually a great group of people called the Internet Identity Workshop. I don't know if you've ever been, Lorena. They meet twice a year. They've met for, I think, the last 20 years, really hashing out a lot of this hard work when it comes to identity and making sure that it's privacy preserving, right? Making sure that it's done. So there's identity of the human, right? There's identity of companies and organizations, and there's a lot of great work happening in our community on that as well. And then there is this identity from an agent perspective as well. So there's I don't know if you heard of this concept of proof of authority, which is some of the work that's happening within our community here across the Linux Foundation, not just at LFDT, but in other cross foundations as well, is how do you verify, right, that agent has the authority to do that action or that thing on my behalf, right? And how do you do that without leaking personal information or any type of information in that transaction as well? So I think it's critical. Many of us have been saying for the last 10 years that identity is critical to payments. Identity is critical to obviously use cases around travel and healthcare, et cetera. And now with the accelerated movement of agents, I really believe that the core principles that our community over the last 10 years have put together. So for example, at Trust Over IP, we have a Trust Over IP graph, and you can see how you build identity at the different layers, in order to be able to deploy these tools and standards as well. I'd love to, maybe have a conversation with you specifically about the topic, because I think there's so much to dig into it. And I really think that agents are going to be the path to getting human identity self-sovereign, right? So that in making sure that it's privacy preserving and self-sovereign on the human side, so that our agents and organizations can also act in that way.
Yes, I find the topic fascinating. We definitely need to speak more about that. As you say, there are so many layers, and studying identity from a different perspective. My background is more sociology, communications, digital studies. We talk not only about identity as this umbrella concept, it's many identities. And now we are seeing it when we are connecting it to tech. It's like 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers. And then you have to actually play with that and realize that it's not only one thing that can identify.
Yeah, it's the existential issue right now because, and it has been for a long time, right, is how do you protect your identity? The concepts of data portability is how, are becoming more and more important. And if you think about all the prompts and all the thing that you're creating as your data identity, right, you're putting a lot of your, mental models into these models. How do you make that portable so that when you go from one AI, GPT system to another, how do you move it? And how do you create ownership of that as well? So I think there's so many layers that really need attention from the market. And, we're here to provide a place for those discussions.
Absolutely. How do you see the main challenges in this sense? In the sense of, what's the priority, especially in terms of education? What's the priority in the next, let's say, 5 years?
Yeah, it's a good question because the next 5 years are going to feel like 5 months, or the next 5 months are going to feel like 5 years. The opposite of that as well. Like I've never seen, right? I've never seen anything move so fast, and sometimes it's scary. I do have hope, and I do believe that some of the greatest minds are working on these issues and making sure that they're doing it in the open, in order to be able to bring a community together much faster and come with solutions. But I seriously think the next 5 months will be 5 years when it comes from an industry perspective. I think the biggest challenges will continue to be regulation. Right. Making sure that the regulators across the world, and I'm talking the same thing from a digital asset perspective to digital identity, that the regulators are educated, that they understand what the technology can do and what the technology cannot do. And Lorena, I kind of say this, and it's probably a bad thing to say, but there's going to be a huge, huge breach. Right. It's going to be something that is going, in the ancient world, particularly, but across, right. Same thing we see in crypto, right? We keep seeing these huge hacks, these huge, issues. These things will happen, and then the communities have to work together to fix them and regulate this. If you've been in the crypto industry for the last 10, 12 years, you've seen this over and over again, right? It's like the cycle, right? Oh, here goes another hack. I mean, they used to be, 2, 4, 5 million. Now they're 250 million, but they continue to grow. But what happens is we get smarter, right? And we start building things that make sense. Same thing from a regulation, right? You start building in a regulation that actually protects the consumer side of it as well. I don't have, if I had a magic ball to look into, I would say, in 5 years' time, from a blockchain perspective, no one's going to talk about blockchain anymore. It's just going to be core technology that powers all industries. That's number one. I used to have a T-shirt in 2018 that said, "Let's stop talking about blockchain." Right? It's a tech. It's going to happen. I should reprint that shirt. So from a blockchain perspective, every single system, is going to rely on blockchain, whether it's a permission distributed ledger or whether it's a public distributed ledger or hybrids of the sort as well. I think we're going to work out all the tooling needed for enterprises. So to do this, one of the things we hear from banks, small, medium, and large, is how do we scale the industry, right? And it's not scaling from just a technical perspective of TPS and number of nodes and all this, but actually scaling the industry so that all the players can have, once again, that, in-house capability of running these systems, of deploying these systems, of good partners that they can work with as well. That's how we scale. So I think there's going to be some big issue that's going to make us all reflect and then, make things better. I think that, tooling needs to be worked on so that the industry can deploy these things faster and better. And third, I really think that the consumers, right, and this is the biggest lift, right? Lorena, you and I probably care very much about our identity online, right? And but the consumers need to also get to a point that they care, right? That we somehow remove the friction of being, protective of our identity, right? Protective of our assets, remove the friction there and make it easy for consumers to understand the importance of it. And I would say that's probably the biggest lift because, as human beings, we always take the easy way out.
Yes, I don't know. It's going to be very interesting. And then there comes AI to change the game and to speed it up at an unprecedented speed. So really, those 5 years are probably too long. Maybe we have to talk about the next 2 years and see,
Yeah.
what our input is going to be in those next 2 years, right? To shape things accordingly.
Exactly. And our community over the last 10 years has grown so much in regards to the type of technology. So we have a lot of new projects in zero knowledge proofs, for example, right? Where these are texts that, didn't exist, didn't exist many years ago, right? A couple of years ago. And these are all things that we have, the brightest minds kind of working on. So I'm feeling very hopeful. I am always feeling that, open source and open governance and open development, how we started our conversation, is going to be the core to really building an inclusive world for all of us, for financial services, for identity, and just, making sure that as human beings, we'll always be human beings. We might have hundreds of bots working for us, but we'll always be human beings, and that the humans really stay at the core.
Brilliant. Well, let's cross our fingers, Daniela, and hopefully, institutions, foundations like the one you're working for are going to actually make a real difference. I think it's definitely the right time for it. So we're going to see.
I think so. And a big thanks to all our community members. I say this all the time, it's not just about me or the staff at the Linux Foundation or LFDT. We have thousands and thousands of contributors and maintainers and organizations that support this mission. And I think it's really critical that we continue to work together and collaborate across ecosystems as well so that we get it right.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Daniela. Thank you for joining us today at CCN, and see you next time.
Thank you, Lorena.